I'm Pat Morrison. The Federal Reserve Board has been the subject of scrutiny since it came into existence, but perhaps nowhere more recently until H.R. 1207, a question of auditing the Fed in a measure before the House of Representatives. The issue of how much authority the Federal Reserve has, as I said, come before both houses of Congress, and there is some alarm at the question of the Fed's power to regulate the nation's biggest financial institutions at a time when billions of dollars have gone out the door to banking institutions, and whether or not that money has been adequately identified and tracked is the subject of that House resolution. I'm joined by two members of the House and one member each of the House and the Senate to talk about where they think the Fed needs to be reined in, where it needs to be regulated, and where it needs to be scrutinized more thoroughly. The first among them is Senator Bernie Sanders, an independent senator from Vermont. Senator, thank you for joining me.
My pleasure.
We have before us an agency of government that has become very powerful very quickly. What are your concerns about the reach of its power and what ought to be done about it?
Well, let me give you one example of my concerns. I'm on the Senate Budget Committee. And in April, we had Chairman Bernanke before the committee. And I asked him if he could tell me which financial institutions received over $2 trillion in zero-interest loans from the Fed. That is a lot of money, and what you are doing is putting at risk $2 trillion of taxpayers' money. And his answer was, no, I can't tell you. And on that day, I introduced legislation to demand that, in fact, that information be made public. So what you have is, as you've indicated, an institution with enormous power, and since the financial crisis on Wall Street, that power has increased very substantially. I think they need accountability. I think the American people need to know what kind of conflicts of interest exist. I think you need transparency in a way that just doesn't exist right now. So we're working on two pieces of legislation, one with Congressman Paul, which demands an audit, a GAO audit of the Fed, and the second, a more simple piece of legislation, which says you lent out $2 trillion, tell us who got that money.
Senator, do you think it was a case of Mr. Bernanke saying, I can't tell or I won't tell?
I think it's I won't tell. I think he gives his reasons why, and he suggests that if the public knew which financial institutions received that money, it would indicate that these institutions might be in trouble. There would be a run on these financial institutions, et cetera, et cetera. And I think that's a pretty absurd argument. I think most of the taxpayers in this country would find it really quite amazing that they could receive financial support from the federal government, zero-interest loans, and not have to tell anybody who it was who received that.
Senator, we had testimony by the General Counsel for the Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve saying, look, we audit this. We have outside audit. We have the Government Accountability Office looking into the Fed. Testimony before Congress 80 times, including 28 times so far this year. What parts of the Fed's workings are unknown?
Well, as one example is just what I told you. If the Fed lends out, $2 trillion of taxpayers' money are being placed at risk. We do not know which institutions receive that. Does that sound like transparency to you?
The testimony of Mr. Alvarez says that Congress deliberately chose to exclude from GAO review both monetary policy deliberations, decisions, and actions, and Federal Reserve transactions for or with foreign central banks. Are there not some areas that should be off limits to that kind of public scrutiny?
I think there may be. But I think what we have seen since the collapse of Wall Street over a year ago is a greatly expanded role of the Fed. They're taking on tremendous new responsibilities, playing an enormously powerful role in our economy. And I think that the old rules do not necessarily apply. There may well be some areas that should be not publicly disclosed. But I think, again, when you're talking about lending out $2 trillion of taxpayers' money, I think the American people have a right to know who got that money, what the terms are, whether there are any conflicts of interest. The reality is, over a year ago, we experienced a major Wall Street meltdown, which was brought about, in my view, by the greed, the recklessness, and illegal behavior of a small number of Wall Street tycoons who made, before the bailout, substantial sums of money and are now back in line to get their welfare checks once again. So I think that these people need to have transparency, and the American people have a right to know how that institution functions.
One of the concerns that was expressed about this, Senator, is that the more that this information is made available and perhaps put under the aegis of the Congress, the more political the uses of monetary policy in this country might become.
Well, given the record of the Fed in recent years, where they basically turned the other eye or maybe contributed to the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression, I think we need to have new approaches to the Fed. Look, these are people who are responsible for millions of people losing their jobs, their savings, their hope for the future. And to suggest that we should not be taking a new approach so that what happened over a year ago does not happen again seems to be short-sighted.
If there were to be this new scrutiny, do you think that you would agree to allow the Fed to have more authority?
Well, I think we have to take a hard look at the role of the Fed, and that is precisely what this discussion is about. But bottom line, again, what has happened over the last year is something that should wake up every American, and our view should be, how do we get into this disaster, which today, if you add unemployment, underemployment, and people who have given up looking for work, 17% of the American population. How do we get into this disaster? Who caused this disaster? How do we hold those people who caused this problem accountable? How do we make sure that never again are we put in a position?
Bringing into the conversation Congressman Ron Paul, a Texas Republican who introduced H.R. 1207 to audit the Fed. Congressman, thank you for joining us.
Thank you. Nice to be with you.
So you're advocating, along with Senator Sanders, this more rigorous auditing of how the Fed operates, but the underlying principle you bring to this is that the Fed should be abolished in the first place.
Yeah, I think we have very similar concerns, especially about transparency, and he and I have shared a view that large corporations and large banks have benefited by our financial structure. So even though he comes from a different angle, we do strongly agree on that. But I think the magnificent thing about 1207 and the 300 people we have co-sponsoring this, I believe we have been able to bring progressives and liberals and libertarians and conservatives and constitutionalists together. And it's mostly because the American people, in many ways, are demanding it. And if we're going to be responsible in Congress, we have to know where this money's going. I mean, they're acting outside the law, and they're acting outside of the Constitution because they just do what they want. They don't even appropriate the money; they just create it. So it's a government unto itself. And these arrangements they have with foreign governments and foreign central banks, I can't see how they're legal. Technically, they're legal because you're right. You earlier said that we gave them permission, but that is, of course, the thing that I want to address because I don't want this much power in the central bank.
So you would revoke some of the or pull in some of the leash that Congress gave to the Fed?
Oh, yes. As a matter of fact, 1207 does that. It eliminates that, and there's a strong move to remove the power for them to bail out banks or corporations directly, and that was put into the Federal Reserve Act in 1913, but essentially not used all these years until the emergency. The big emergency came. But no, I think it's very important that we restudy this whole issue and relook at the power they have because I quite frankly believe strongly that the Federal Reserve has been the culprit in creating the business cycle and now the crisis that we have now, because they created the business cycle in benefiting the financial institutions, the large corporations, and big government, and now the bailouts have gone to them. The bailouts haven't gone to the little people. The little people lost their houses. So they aren't taking care of the people, and yet it's up to us in the Congress to try to straighten this mess out.
Congressman